Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this new installment of Infinite Progress. And what we're doing today is a little bit different than some of the themes we've had in terms of having a debate or discussion. Today, we're going to do something more like an interview. And as you could tell from the intro, we're going to be discussing not just music in general, which we did a couple months ago, but we're really going to funnel that down to a genre that I'm going to call heavy music. And heavy music, I'm using that term because I know there's some music snobs out there that are very particular about how things get labeled. And so heavy music is going to cover anything from what could be called hard rock all the way up to speed metal or death metal. And so we're going to run the whole gambit from, punk, alternative, hardcore, thrash, grindcore, metalcore, death metal, speed metal, kind of everything in between. And we're not just talking about those particular genres in general, but we're talking about Christians who play that style of music. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, I don't think of Christians playing that kind of music. Probably you're thinking of Christian music being more something like this. Now, I know some of you think that when you think of Christians playing music, that it's probably something more like that, or just classical, or, the old-time gospel types of music. But in recent decades, that there's actually has been a growing number of musicians who are Christian in their worldview that are playing this style of music. Now, originally, this is sort of birthed out of or came to fruition from a type of theology or doctrine or spiritual motivation from what was called the Jesus movement. And for lack of a better term, the Jesus movement was basically Christian hippies. Now, there were some other groups that kind of came out of that, which was things like the Calvary Chapel and others. But in general, what this was a group of young believers and Christians that felt motivated or inclined to take their gifting of music and take a particular style of music to reach a segment of the culture using their vocation, their gifts, in serving their neighbor by reaching a group of people that may otherwise never come into contact with the gospel because of things like image or style or something along those lines. Now, I want to introduce you to a fellow, Pastor Bob, resides near Nashville, Tennessee, and he's one of the actually early individuals that helped get this music off the ground with a Christian worldview. Now, he was asked a very similar question as to how can Christians listen to or play heavy metal? Let's see what he has to say.
Well, what do you do with this kind of thing? Well, there's two things that are important. First of all, that you understand that there are different kinds of music in the church. This guy was saying that we should just really be listening to worship music. It's the only thing that is Christian. And wow, worship music has changed over the years too. We could talk about those controversies as well. But the Bible really talks about two different kinds of music. And in the Psalms, it has both kinds. There is worship where you quiet your heart and you worship the Lord. And we all have that in common. No matter what kind of music you like or style of music you like, everybody has worship as a common denominator. But then there is celebration, and that can be anything. In Psalm 150, David is celebrating. He's making a lot of noise. The loud clanging cymbals, the stringed instruments, all of the things that are making a lot of noise and celebrating his faith. You suppose he had the same controversy then? Well, that's really what it boils down to. And here's the point. Folks, I realize that if I wasn't in the middle of all of this, if I didn't know metal, and if I actually hadn't worked all of these years in rock and metal ministry, I probably wouldn't get it either, honestly. And I think sometimes the burden of proof is on us. The Bible says, by their fruits you will know them, and there is a lot of fruit in this ministry. But if you've never seen it, and if it's never been presented to you, then sometimes you don't know. And so I always feel like the burden of proof really is on me. If there are people that don't understand, I'll invite them to a concert. I'll invite them to sit down and talk. I'll ask them to come and listen to a few people share their testimonies of how they got saved, with this particular ministry. But you see, all those things are important, and sometimes the burden of proof really is on us who enjoy the music. It's on us to begin to show other people what really is going on.
Well, I think that was a pretty good answer to that. That a lot of it does have to do with taste in some situations. And I think if we're all honest, we can resonate with that a little bit. I think we go through different moods, maybe even sometimes during a week. There's times where maybe you go to the gym and you need something a little more aggressive, a little heavier to help get you through it. Maybe you're just enjoying a cup of coffee and reading a book and you just want classical, or maybe some good swing, blues style jazz while you're reading. I think we all kind of experience that range of emotion, but in general, I think some of us generally are drawn to a particular style of music. Now, that may ask the question, but doesn't heavy metal music and heavy music, as its, emphasis, kind of come out of a rebellion, something that's opposed to conservative ideas, whether it be religion or morals or things along that line? Well, it's actually interesting. I think most music historians would grant that rock and roll was actually birthed out of the Southern gospel churches. If you went back far enough, the Southern black gospel churches, based on the song arrangements, the tempo, even the volume, is actually the birth of rock and roll. So technically, if you go back far enough, Christians and Christian styles of music actually gave birth to what became rock and roll. Now, granted, heavy metal seems to have an image that's a little more darker. I want to introduce you to a fella, Dave Mustaine, and a lot of you will be very familiar with him. But for those that are not, he's one of the founders of the band Metallica, and he's also kind of the main figure in the band Megadeth. Now, his role and influence is in a particular genre of metal called thrash metal, which got kicked off around the early 80s. Now, he's going to give an interesting take on being an individual who was in that style of music, first of all, not as a Christian, but then becomes converted and describes why he stays in that style of music. Let's check it out.
Mustaine is currently on tour in Europe with what's called the Big Four, his current and former bands, plus Anthrax and Slayer.
Are people right when they say that heavy metal music is infused with the power of the devil?
In some cases, yes, but not in all cases, because you've got great heavy metal bands that believe in God and glorify Him. We pray every night before we go on stage.
That sounds great.
For a 50-year-old,
you happy with it?
50-year-old man, it feels pretty damn good.
He shows me a chord progression called the tritone, also known as the Devil's Interval.
The Devil's Tritone is made up of these three notes, and this note right here drops down one. So it goes. So listen to the difference. It just sounds evil, doesn't it?
It sounds darker.
Which is why the progression is used so frequently in death metal. Mustaine says he is a Christian now, but wasn't always.
My mom was a Jehovah's Witness. I was brought up as a witness, and I revolted into the witchcraft because I hated going out and knocking on people's doors.
Yes, witchcraft. As a teenager, Mustaine says, he cast 2 hexes. The first was on a bully who sucker punched him.
From what I heard, he got in a car accident, and something happened to part of his body that I had targeted and hex, and that showed me that it was real.
The second was on a girl he was in a class with.
Everybody wanted her, including me, but she was so out of my batting average and just totally out of my league. And I did it, and the next day she was in my apartment.
You were convinced that these hexes, spells that you were casting, worked.
I was, and I do believe in the dark side. Most people think that, black magic and witchcraft and stuff like that isn't real or it doesn't work, and I know that it works.
Mustaine's fascination with the occult continued into his adulthood.
I was doing a lot of blood pacts with people. This is before we found out about AIDS. It was real simple stuff where you cut your thumb and you rub it with somebody else and you become blood brothers. I don't want to make a spiritual covenant and mixing my life with somebody else who I don't know who they are or how they are. The Bible said that blood is life.
And like so many people we have met, Mustaine believes that he opened the door to demonic forces, which had a profound impact on his life.
Was your abuse of alcohol related to the satanic influences that you'd been dabbling in?
I'll say this. Every time I drank, I did not always do activities that were satanic, but any time I had been doing anything that was satanic, I had been drinking.
So
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. There was a relationship then.
Absolutely.
There are some songs Mustaine will no longer sing. Like Megadeth's cover of the Sex Pistols' Anarchy in the UK. And he says he believes he's better for it.
I think that I'm more dangerous now that I've become a Christian than I ever was before when I was trying to go the opposite route, because I'm armed with the truth now.
Well, as you can see there from what Dave had said that it seems as though there is a darker side to that music, to the point that there's certain songs he won't even play anymore because he remembered the mindset and the worldview that he had when he wrote and played those songs. There's other songs that really, you could be secular, atheist, Christian, and because their themes are more political or some other type of subject that, yeah, I could still play that. I could still buy into that. And then there are others that have more of possibly a Christian theme. And he was able to discuss even things like chord progressions and chord notes, some that are a little darker than other chords. But overall, he's comfortable being in that style of music. Well, what does that say about someone who's been a Christian their whole life and they go into that culture? Now, I know there may be some that are concerned about that would say, yeah, but he was familiar with that, so he knew how to set up certain safeguards to sort of protect his heart and mind from those temptations that are in that culture. And plus, he's kind of a little bit older. Well, that's actually a really good point. There was a band that had some popularity and notoriety in the scene for the past decade, a band called As I Lay Dying. And their lead singer, Tim Lambesis, had basically confessed that by their last studio album, he was a full-blown atheist. Now, what led to that could be several factors, but we certainly know there's a lot of temptations in that scene. There's the spiritual temptation, a lot of darkness within that style of music. There's the intellectual temptation. You're going to get challenged a lot about your Christian worldview. There's the sensual temptation, drugs and the sexual temptations that could possibly happen. So if you're the only Christian band and you're in a festival or you're at a concert with all these other bands that are secular or even satanic, there's a lot of darkness there. So you may think, man, what's that going to do to a Christian band? Well, here's a quote that's attributed to Tim Lambesis about what some of these Christian metal bands, how they actually exercise their faith, or better yet, lack thereof. Let's check it out.
We toured with more Christian bands who actually aren't Christians, bands that are. In 12 years of touring with As I Lay Dying, I would say maybe 1 in 10 Christian bands we toured with were actually Christian bands. That's 9 out of 10, he says.
Well, as you can see there, that seems pretty depressing. It seems as though, you know what? If this genre, if this style of music is just chewing up Christian bands and spitting them out 90%, and making them worse off than when they got here, it's probably better to just leave that thing alone. And if that statistic is true, I could probably grant that. That even though if there is a band who's strong enough spiritually and stable enough mentally to handle that they're reaching a group of people that otherwise would never be exposed to the gospel, is it really worth it to lose that many members? Does that make sense? Kind of sounds like a bad trade-off, right? For every one of you we gain, we're losing 9 of ours. Doesn't sound like a pretty good trade-off at all. Well, we're going to talk about that and several other issues today as we interview the lead singer from the band You the Few. And we're going to check out this little short clip of the video from the band just to give you a taste of the style of music that they play. And make sure to stick around to the very end of the conversation where we'll play the entire video for those that are interested. Again, thank you for tuning in. Let's check out this video clip and we'll get into the interview.
And no, it was real.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that little video clip as we are here with Nao Lewandowski, lead singer of You the Few. And we're going to discuss some of these issues that we kind of covered on that intro. And we'll start with, Nao, just share with everybody your worldview in general, and specifically your kind of confessional allegiance, doctrinal statement, denomination affiliation, whatever fancy term that would help our listeners understand kind of your background theologically that kind of gives you, we can call it the freedom or the motivation to play this style of music.
Sure. I would consider myself a non-denominational follower and disciple of Christ, saved only by his grace and love, to be reunited with God, a Trinitarian God. And my personal statement of faith is just the Apostles' Creed, so I won't go into it, but you can go ahead and look that up, and that's basically the outline of my faith. I grew up in the evangelical church and knew Jesus my whole life. I was lucky enough to have parents that were extremely involved in our spiritual lives as mentors and leaders. And I was about 11 years old when I got baptized. It was just the next step in my life. Even as a kid, I just kind of knew that my job in the kingdom couldn't be done until I just made the next step of declaring Jesus as my Savior. So that's kind of personally how I came to know Christ, is he was just always in my house and in my life. So I consider myself extremely lucky there. And that's always created a big space for me to create art and music in the name of God.
Would you be able to unpack that a little bit? Is there any specifics that you could lean toward of how your personal doctrine feeds your creativity and how you and your bandmates are able to create the style of music lyrically, guitar tones, tempo, things of that nature?
Sure. When I was graduating high school, I had decided that I wanted to go to music college, and I found Visible Music College in Memphis. That was in 2011, and I came there and switched my major to songwriting. And over the next 3 years, I experienced a lot of personal pain and loss, and I was just kind of wrestling a lot with my own faith, and that was tying in a lot with my songwriting. And God put the right classes and the right professors in front of me, and the right friends, honestly, to build this band. And I was convicted to just dig deeper into theology and the truth. I was convicted to do that in my own songwriting because it became a huge responsibility to me. We're writing music that other people will sing, and we're putting thoughts in their head and words in their mouths. And so throughout time, I was also in the band, and we were gaining some pretty serious momentum in the scene in Memphis. And I just started hearing stories from kids at shows about their pain and their questions and their doubts. And it just ultimately just fueled a fire for me to make sure that as we were on the stage and we were the ones holding the microphone, that we were speaking truth to them. So it really just laid in a huge conviction lyrically. But also I'm hugely inspired by God's creation and just the art that he's created all around us. And I feel like our music should reflect that, and it should be beautiful and excellent. And our craft, we should be practicing. We should be making good quality music apart from our faith, but just like for the sake of our faith, if that makes sense. You're practicing apart from it in order to serve it, if that makes sense. But heavy music has been a passion of mine for a long time. I grew up going to shows, and I just love the intensity of it and the aggressive nature, and I respect the technicality and the musicianship. So that also played a huge part in kind of how we all ended up here in this band. We all just had a love for it, and we immersed ourselves in the scene and immersed ourselves in what it took to be a part of it. And a lot of that is studying how to write songs in that genre. And we paired that with how to write songs that were theologically sound.
That's very good. Now, some of our audience may be sitting there thinking, well, no, wait a minute. Are all you crazy Christian headbangers trying to get this style of music played on Sunday morning during worship? Is that your motivation? Is that why you play this? Could you defend that biblically if that's what you're trying to do, or doctrinally would you defend that? And if not, if you couldn't play this on Sunday morning, then really why play it at all?
It's a good question. I don't necessarily know if it's a question of if it should or shouldn't be played, because honestly, I don't take offense to people who don't prefer the extreme sound. You know, I would take more offense if they were telling me that I was not being a Christian by playing it. Like, my mom doesn't particularly love our genre, but she's still incredibly supportive of our cause and what we do it for. It's not everyone's cup of tea, and ultimately, I think the church should reach as many people as it can, and I understand that metal is not something that the majority of a congregation will be able to worship to, and that's fine. That's fine with me. I think it would be wrong to stand in the way of a congregation's interaction with the Holy Spirit just because I want people to accept my music. But on the other hand, I also think it's unwise to exclude a genre of music from the category of worship just because it isn't widely accepted. You know, just because it's not widely accepted doesn't mean it's unacceptable. I used to play on a worship team for the Salvation Army, and we would go and play a metal show on Saturday night and then come to church and play worship, contemporary worship, on Sunday mornings. And personally, I got a more worshipful experience at the metal show. That's how I communicate with God, though. And I would hate to be judged, or I would hate for that to be deemed as unacceptable just because it's not what the world has created as right in the church. You know, the Bible says to sing to each other in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making a joyful noise to the Lord. And it doesn't say that metal is evil. It doesn't say that country music is evil. It doesn't say that rap is evil. It's all about the heart, you know. And some would argue that the nature of the music is evil, but honestly, I try to write music that reflects reality, and whether that's a reflection of earthly pain or a call to action, it's intense. You know, Jesus is intense, and sometimes his singing just doesn't do it for me. I just need to scream it with every ounce of my being. And is there a setting for that? Absolutely. Is it the church? Maybe. But you know, the world has molded itself into a category of what's acceptable, and that image is not exclusively right.
Well, that you bring up an interesting point. It kind of segues into the next question: is it actually the right place for Christians to engage in a particular music genre that seemingly was invented as a rebellion against all things conservative, whether it be religiously, ethically, politically? It just seems that this genre of music was sort of invented as a rebellion against most of the things that you would personally stand for. Try to address that to both a Christian and a non-Christian audience. So if somebody's a Christian, they may have that same quote, and somebody that's a secular atheist who listens to that style of music may say the same thing. How would you answer either one of those kind of in that whole genre of, man, does a Christian really belong here?
Right. Well, to a non-Christian, I would say to observe the fact that Christian music is the only genre of music that is determined by its content rather than its musicality. So, you know, you think jazz, you think hip hop, any other genre you can think of, and it's all about the musicality. So why should Christianity have its own genre? Why can't we sing about what we believe in our realities in this class of musicality? So I would challenge it that way. And for a Christian, I would challenge it and say that there was a time when electric guitars were unthinkable in the church, and even a drum set or a minor chord. You know, minor chords were thought to be dissonant and evil. And does that mean we shouldn't use them in our worship service today? Probably not. Over time, we discovered that minor chords, and they allow for harmonic movement in music that creates depth and value without necessarily having to be claimed as evil. And I think to reach a people that speak a certain language, you have to understand the language. And then and only then can you affect or redirect the content of your music. You know, at the end of the day, it's just music. And what you say and what you prompt with it are really what matters. And I don't really think, at least not that I've encountered, I haven't encountered any non-Christians who have any kind of territorial claim on the sound of music, you know, and I think they'd tell you the same thing. For the most part, it's a pretty, at least what I've experienced, it's a pretty open and welcoming place to whoever. But there's enough music for everyone, and who's to say that a certain musical genre is off limits to certain content? I mean, it's just people. It's not biblical, and it's not God.
Mm. Now, you had mentioned something earlier when you talked about growing up, enjoying this style of music. You kind of used the term "the scene." Would you prescribe, or do you think it ought to be prescribed that both Christians as individuals who are simply consumers of music and Christian bands should really only interact in Christian festivals, like what used to be the Cornerstone, Purple Door, Face Down Fest, which I think that's still going on. Should Christian bands and Christians individually only engage themselves in that type of setting? Or is there a place for Christian bands to play in other arenas, Warped Tour, the old Ozfest, or something like that?
In my opinion, Christian bands should not limit themselves to only Christian festivals. I know that those festivals are great, and I have nothing personally against them. I know a lot of people are moved and their lives are changed there. You know, I was one of those. People in the church and in the Christian community need the same care and outreach that non-Christian communities do. However, I don't tend to agree with any form of exclusivity in music. You know, we're called to be salt and light and going and making disciples. And, you know, how are we going to do that if we box ourselves into the Christian community? I think the ultimate role of any art is to point back to the glory of God, you know, the ultimate creator. And he's the creator of everything, and therefore even art outside of the church is his. You know, Christians are still humans, so we can talk to humans and connect to humans on a real level with our art. And I think not only are we able to, but we're called to do that. And as far as going out and playing secular venues and secular festivals, I will say that our band has had some of the most powerful evangelistic experiences there. We went on tour last fall with a band called Convictions, and about halfway through, we were booked in Georgia at this Ordo Templi facility, and very satanic and very dark. It was just a bar, and we had no idea until we got there. And at the beginning of that night, both of our bands were feeling the weight of all the darkness. You know, we were both bands of faith, and it was just really heavy. And that was the first time that we all prayed together at the show. Normally each band would pray on their own, but we knew that we needed the strength and support of one another. And while we were playing, those guys scattered themselves around the room, and we knew they were praying for protection and for the Holy Spirit and all of that. And then we did the same for them. And by the end of the night, I got to talk to this man about how he fell away from God and from Jesus kind of at a young age, and that this show was the first experience he had of God in many, many years. You know, he told me all about his life. He turned to a life of crime and even murder, and you know, it was just a rough place for him, and he was weeping in tears, just touched by what we believed, you know. And there are settings that are hard to stand strong in, for sure, and there are times when you have to make the call not to participate, and that's between you and your band and God and your discernment. But as long as you have a band who is on the same page about not compromising your faith and your belief, and as long as you have the support of them, then where two or more are gathered, God is there. And it's how you prepare your spirit and your mind and your heart for those circumstances. You know, we enter those places as a mission field, you could say, and if we just wanted to participate with our lifestyle, that's a bit more concerning. you know. But does it look bad to be a Christian band at a dark festival or a dark venue? I mean, if I'm being real, I don't really care. That's not really my concern. It's between the audience and God, and I just hope that my duty to the kingdom is upheld and my integrity is still upheld.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point. We showed obviously some clips in the intro pertaining to the lead singer of As I Lay Dying, who the band had progressed into some of these darker venues. I'm also reminded as a young apologetic student of an individual, Dr. Ross Clifford from Australia. He takes a group of individuals, and it's called incarnational apologetics. And it really embodies what you're proclaiming here, that they go to these mind, body, and spirit festivals, which are, kind of this haven of New Age thought. And at every one of those festivals out on the West Coast, you're going to see this little tent of this little Australian accented Baptist believers standing there witnessing. And Ross Clifford does that, and he trains up these young people, takes them to these, and he calls it incarnational apologetics, where they learn the lingo, they learn some of the common ground language that they can reach out to these people. And he gave one example of taking tarot cards and walking somebody through the gospel with tarot cards. So instead of, kind of holding up the cross, get away from me, that's evil and dark, he says, in Christ, we have authority, snatch it out of their hands and use it for a gospel proclamation. It was actually pretty cool watching him do it. So I kind of see an image of incarnational apologetics, the way that you phrased it. Now, in light of what happened to individuals like, Lambesis, and there's other bands who over the years, if they had a proclamation of faith, they have certainly walked away from it. I can think of Chevelle as an example. When they first got started, was on Squint Records, and pretty much by the second album, they were sort of off and running. I think He Is Legend, possibly Come Back. There's just several bands that seem to, over the years, have kind of moved away from that. And based on that statistic, that if Lambesis actually said that in all the years he toured, only 1 in 10 bands were actually Christian. So how does a Christian band maintain their Christian faith if they go into these darker arenas, such as the one that you expressed? And would you, based on your experience, obviously, do you think that only 1 in 10 bands that proclaim Christianity are actually Christian? Is it really that bad?
Personally, I haven't experienced it the way that he phrased it. I haven't experienced it as that bad. I don't doubt it. I think the scene that our band is in is a little bit more post-hardcore and metalcore, and maybe that has something to do with it. It's not as deep into the death metal sounds and the super heavy subgenres of metal, and maybe that has something to do with it. But it is definitely a place of responsibility, and just as if you took a place, like a position as a pastor, you're taking up a huge weight of responsibility. You have unbelievable standards of accountability, and it's, from an earthly standpoint, it might not seem fair, but at the same time, if it's your call and your conviction, it's an eternal conviction that you have to obey, and how do we maintain it? I go back to having bandmates that will hold you accountable. It creates a lot of awkward conversations and a lot of calling people out whenever you just really don't want to be called out. But, there are times whenever we have to stop and say, hey, if we never play in front of a crowd bigger than 5 kids, is that enough? And if we never get a record deal, is that enough? Or if we never get to play this festival, is that enough? And just constantly reevaluate why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, that is a good point. Would you, oftentimes it's charged or accused that, okay, you're allowed to play in the scene, We grant that it's okay for you to be here, but oftentimes, man, the level of quality of music that Christian bands have in comparison to more secular-based bands, it just doesn't seem to be there. It seems as though it just looks awkward. It doesn't seem to have either production quality, musicianship. Is that an accurate accusation at all, or would you push back on that and say, you know what, no, we're really doing some good things out there? And kind of a second layer to that question is, in what ways do you think that the Christian worldview can be a benefit to that genre, that music industry, where bands and labels seem to be scrambling on how to financially deal with this sort of new wave of financial income? I saw in kind of a communications textbook in my undergrad years where they talked about a lot of these bands in the early 20th century, around the 1920s, they freaked out when they invented the album. They freaked out when they started putting songs on radio, on public radio, because they felt like, oh my goodness, we'll never make money if people can hear music for free. And it was this big shockwave, and they thought it was the end of music. And of course, that wasn't the case. And if anybody has seen the CNN special where they chronicle decades, they do like the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. When they did the 80s, when they invented cassette tapes that you could record, the music industry said the same thing. It's like, oh, music's dead. You know, we'll never survive. We'll never be financially viable. So this new digital age is just this rehashing of things that's happened all over again. With Spotify, Pandora, people are having to find new ways to be financially viable. I give all that as a background to simply say, where does the Christian worldview fit into that, along with the idea of quality within the metal and hardcore scene and stuff?
Yeah. As far as the quality level, I've witnessed a lot of really good quality musicians in my short time in the scene. You know, I don't speak as I'm this lifelong veteran here, but the idea that all Christians are less talented honestly breaks my heart. You know, I think because there is a little bit of truth lingering there waiting to be addressed, you know, I think the kind of Christian-based metal that we play, at least, is relatively new. So there are a lot of musical barriers to break through within the Christian community, let alone outside of it. There's also some spiritual barriers to break through and spiritual stereotypes that need to be addressed. You know, I went to a Christian music college, same one I teach at now, and it's something I've struggled with for the last 5 years or so. And I don't really think the problem is that Christians aren't as talented. I think the problem is that as Christians, we give ourselves too much lenience on what's expected of us. You know, we let all the expectations fall on the shoulders of our faith and say that we're saved and have grace, and somehow that takes the pressure off of perfecting our art. And that's completely the wrong way to approach it. You know, truthfully, Christians should be making the best art precisely because we do it in the name of God. Like I said, Christian metal is making tremendous steps in the industry in regards to talent. You know, there are some bands that Christians and non-Christians will call, you know, masters of certain subgenres. So obviously it's not that all Christians are less talented. It may just be that the Christian community has created such a big platform of faith that they're able to support the best 50% of bands instead of just the very top elite 10%. And that's kind of a good and a bad thing. You know, it's good because there's a big platform. It's being used for the kingdom. And it's great. But it's bad because the standards get watered down and, you know, more people are accepted. And that's not always a good thing. And I think as far as what the Christian worldview can do, I think metal bands need to make quality metal, period. You know, whether you're a Christian or not, you should still work as hard as you can, educate yourself in your craft, and never relax. You know, one of my colleagues recently told me that it's like comfort is the enemy of change. And it's true. If we get too comfortable in our faith, then our art will never change for the better. And Christians have a longer way to work to get their way into you know, lists of top 10 metal bands, because not only do we have to seek excellence in our message and our theology, but we also have to seek excellence in our craft. You know, it's not impossible. And yeah, I'm offended when people disregard my band's talent or technicality because of our Christian status. But it more makes me sad that it's come to that. You know, we practice twice a week, and we all got music degrees, and some people may disagree, but I think it's important to separate your faith from your skill at certain times so that you can sharpen each edge of the sword to the best of your ability. And, you know, how can we make a positive impact? We can make good music, and then people will start listening to what we have to say. And I think by creating good quality music, we gain trust. And the Christian worldview can really speak truth if we put a priority on making sure we're speaking eloquently and excellently.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's very encouraging. And in the clip that we saw in the intro, Dave Mustaine talked about after his conversion, he felt he was a better musician now because he was armed with the truth. And I just felt like that was a fantastic statement, the way that he illustrated that. And people can chronicle his band's progression over the years, whether anybody wants to argue, well, you know, Peace Sells and Rust in Peace and even Count Under, like that was his best stuff. Yeah, Endgame was really good in this new album, but I would say his older stuff is better. I mean, that could be one thing or the other, but at least by his own testimony, he feels as though this sort of rekindled worldview has enabled him to write better. And that another thing he said in there where he talked about lyrical content, where he said there's certain songs he just won't play anymore because he remembered the mindset that he was in when he used to write those songs, that there's other songs he feels he can play for one reason or another. Help our audience out in terms of how art, Ravi Zacharias mentions oftentimes, and I think he got from Norman Geisler, that there's 3 levels of worldview expression: the theoretical, the existential, and the prescriptive. And so the theoretical is kind of that first layer where theories and deductions or inductions are actually made. This is your Plato and Aristotle kind of thing. But the second level, the existential, is actually expressed in the arts. This is your music and film and things of that nature, where a worldview is coming out in that expression. How aware should listeners be of lyrical content with some of the bands that they listen to? How would you encourage them to kind of pay attention to what they're listening to, that there actually is a worldview coming at them, that this isn't just noise, this isn't just random, it's actually very specifically crafted, not just for you as a Christian who's trying to represent the truth that way, but everybody's trying to do that. Is there a way that you could sort of help our audience understand to be maybe better listeners of music?
Yeah, I'm a songwriting instructor, so you've hit on something that I'm absolutely 100% passionate about. Lyrics matter so much. They do. I would say that, you know, there are some types of listeners who will get hooked by the music, and that's really all they need, is to be hooked by the music. But truth is, you're singing along to it, or screaming along to it, or whatever, and you are actually putting those words into life. You know, you are speaking them into your world and into your existence. So there is weight to that. You know, God spoke the world into existence. So obviously, he put a heavy emphasis on words from the very beginning of creation. And I guess as a musician, I know that the music gives you a lot of the emotion, but the words that I write are literally me saying, this is what I'm trying to convey, even with the music. So it's so important, man, because songwriters and musicians in general, they express everything that they've got in their worldview. You know, whatever goes in, that's what's going to come out in their music. So if they're taking in a lot of anger, then you're going to hear a lot of anger. If they're taking in a lot of God and a lot of Christian values, then that's what you're going to hear. And some people shut the door after they hear that first like drop tuned guitar, and It's like you gotta take a minute and listen to the worldview that's coming out, and then try to understand why that lyrical content is being backed up by this emotion of music. You know, try to connect the dots, and that will really set you free as a listener, because then you can really start to understand music and understand art and understand the way that it transcends.
Yeah, very good. He talked about kind of even a certain chord progression that was a little bit darker. I know you had mentioned earlier about kind of the worship wars, so to speak, in terms of, you know, what even notes could be played. Do you think that worldview is that detailed in the music writing process, that even down to kind of the very notes, that they could be good or evil? Or do you think that must be shaped within the lyrical content, that the notes in and of themselves may or may not convey good or bad, right or wrong, but it takes the lyrical shaping to put that framework on there? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I will say there are a lot of studies about how intervals and how chords affect the brain, just biologically and psychologically. You know, there's a lot of value to that, and I don't disregard that, and I don't want to like write that off, because there is definitely something there to it. But I don't think that's the definitive, the final statement. You know, if you truly want to understand, then yes, you need to rely more on the lyrical content to kind of get that across. But it is something to be aware of. You know, as a songwriter myself and as a Christian band, it is important for me to balance those dissonant chords and those kind of more dark sounding tonalities with, I have to balance it with truth, because if not, then it sounds dark, and it is dark because there's no hope there. You know, you don't give your music and your notes any hope, and your ears are sitting there waiting for resolution that you're just not going to give it. And that reflects in the way that you hear it. And if your lyrics don't kind of correct that, then there's no reason not to believe that there is no resolution.
That's awesome. Well, share with our audience, if you would, Nao, for those that are interested, if you have any upcoming tour dates, if I don't know what venues you play in, maybe there's a youth group or something that has a budget, they'd like to book you. How would they get more information about the band, your upcoming shows, merchandise, things of that nature?
Absolutely. You can find all of our information at youthefew.com. Pretty simple. Or you can find us on Facebook. There's contact pages everywhere. Message us. We love to talk, and we have played youth groups. We love playing youth groups. It's quite the experience. We tend to play locally in Memphis and around the Mid-South, Mississippi, Louisiana, but we are completely hungry to play everywhere we possibly can. We just had a big run of shows, so we are kind of taking time off to reevaluate our next album. So we're going to talk through that and just kind of get things in line. But we're really excited to get back into the writing process, because it's time.
Awesome. Now, how would people get a hold of your album? Are you on iTunes or anything?
Yep. We are on iTunes and Spotify and basically all your digital distributors. And you can also hear the album on our website, same place. Yeah, and there's lyrics up there, and pretty much everything you need is on that website.
Outstanding. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. And everybody, stick around. Here's the full video from You the Few. Hope you enjoy it, and thanks for tuning in.